Hi everyone, welcome to dot point A7, and today we're looking at evaluating the management techniques available to farmers to manipulate growth and development, including hormone growth promotants, feed additives, and genetics. So first of all, this dot point is an evaluate. So clearly you need to know a lot of detail about it. You need to know advantages, disadvantages, and you need to be able to make a judgment about the different techniques. And so they're basically, you're needing to evaluate things the farmers can do to change the growth and development. This is important here, growth and development, including hormone growth promotants or HGPs, feed additives, and genetics. All right, so thanks to Kate for letting me copy this sheet. First of all, we need to remind ourselves what growth and development is. So growth is a change in height and weight over time, while development is a change in shape and carcass composition over time. And carcass composition just means what the carcass is composed of. So that involves fat, muscle, and bone. And so the three things that we're looking at here are feed additives, things that are added in small amounts to the feed that the animal is getting. Genetics or breeding, and that's used to choose animals that are good quality and incorporating those traits into the herd. And then lastly, hormonal growth promotants, and this is how the hormone is implanted. So a device, a little, often a silicon kind of device that has hormone inside of it, either testosterone or estrogen or a few others, is implanted in the often the neck or behind the ear of the cow, and it slowly releases hormone over time. So let's have a look at the first of the three. So feed additives are compounds that are added to the rations for reasons other than nutrition. So we're not talking about carbs or protein or anything like that, but we're talking about these extra things that have a different function to the feed. So we've got examples here. Urea blocks might be used as well, and urea blocks often might be combined with salt for the animals to lick them, and that urea can be turned into protein by the microbes in a ruminant. Another common one is antibiotics, which are used in animal feeds to prevent them from getting sick. And obviously, if they get sick, they're going to stop growing or slow down or lose weight. And so putting antibiotics in their feed prevents them from getting sick and keeps their growth rates higher. Magnesium oxide is something else that might be added, and it ensures that stomach pH is not too acidic, because remember, in a ruminant stomach, you want it to be roughly neutral, as the microbes need to be able to live in there. And the last one, ionophores, are things that can be added to the feed of often ruminants. So they have an effect on absorption in the digestive system, and they allow the digestive system to absorb the compounds that it needs to absorb across into the bloodstream more effectively. And so ionophores help, and they're a feed additive as well. So first of all, positives of these things. Really, if you're in an exam, you probably only need to remember maybe two of these feed additives, even probably one. It's helpful to know two. You don't need to know all of them, but different people will remember different ones better than others. So firstly, antibiotics can limit bacterial growth, and that obviously is going to lead to continued high growth rate. It's easier to add to rations than feeding individual animals, if we're talking about all of these feed additives. It's going to help maintain health. It's going to increase growth rates of the animal. So that's antibiotics. They're the positives of antibiotics. Now, obviously, antibiotics are going to be expensive to add to the feed of every cow, but it still is beneficial because the amount of extra growth that occurs by preventing animals from being sick does make that money back. Negatives of feed additives. So over time, if we look on a larger scale, the overuse of antibiotics leads to resistance occurring, and that's just a concept you would need to look up, a biological concept. But if you keep using antibiotics, it kills off all the microbes, bacteria, etc., that are not resistant, and so the only ones that remain are ones that are resistant to that antibiotic, and so they multiply, and then you have a population that is increasingly resistant. So using antibiotics whole scale, widespread, is not a good idea. There's also ethical concerns. People people prefer to have their meat not have anything added to it, and even though it's arguable whether it doesn't likely cause any issue in humans when it's consumed, it is seen by consumers as a bad thing. So people will be wanting to pay less for it. It can be costly. Obviously, there's more effort and increased quantities. All feed additives basically pretty much can be toxic if they're given into high amounts. Okay, so an evaluation, here's an example of an evaluation, but really you need to, if you're still doing this, you need to do your own evaluation. There's no point necessarily copying one out. You need to think about what your opinion is on the above feed additives and why you think they're good or bad. Hormone growth promotants. So these are basically going to improve feed conversion ratio, FCR, or food conversion efficiency, FCE, which is exactly the same thing. So these are, as I mentioned before, they supplement hormones that are either naturally occurring in an animal, example testosterone, or they might be based on other hormones but completely artificial. But they are, as I mentioned before, they are injected into the neck area behind the ear of the cow, and in a kind of pelletized, like little silicon kind of pellet, and it releases hormones slowly over time. So what are they and how do they work? As I mentioned, they're implanted on the skin, and often 70 to 200 days they will release those hormones for about that long, and then after that time, I mean, if you needed more, you would need to implant more. And it seems that about 40% of beef in Australia are raised using HGPs, or hormone growth promotants, so extra hormones to supplement their own hormones in their body. So it adds about $210 million to the beef industry. So examples of HGPs, it's easy to remember testosterone, estrogen, some progesterone as well. These are the ones that are commonly used. If you're going to remember hormones that are used as HGPs, those are the easiest ones. And we know what testosterone does, or we'll learn about testosterone in the next dot point, A8 and A9. So if you don't know what testosterone does, it's good to go to A8 and have a look there, and why you would want to implant the hormone testosterone into a male animal. So the positives are you get an improved growth rate, and it helps the animal to convert food more efficiently to weight gain or muscle, and so it can lead to about 10 to 30% more muscle. So if you're writing an answer to a HSC question and it's asking you to evaluate things such as HGPs, it'd be great if you could include statistics. Statistics are things that are going to guarantee you marks. They're really, really good to include, and it guarantees if it's a kind of 6-mark question that you can kind of get that last mark that has that's usually given for detail. So it also manipulates growth with lower feed, which will help increase profit margins and ultimately, as we mentioned, increase food conversion ratio. So you're getting the same amount of muscle gain for less food, or you're getting more muscle gain for the same amount of food. Now the negatives are the ethical concerns, what consumers think about it as well. The EU, the European Union, has banned hormones and in animals, in cattle in particular. So we cannot export any of our cows, which, as we said before, is 40% of cattle that we produce use HGPs, and so we cannot export those to the European Union. However, the European Union is not a big market for us anyway for cattle. We sell a lot more beef to other places in Asia, in the US, etc. But there are ethical concerns, and there's a small impact on meat cutting quality. So it's thought that there's some science now saying that hormone growth promotants, HGPs, do actually lead to the meat being maybe a bit tougher and might need cooking or dry aging for a bit longer. The other downside is that consumers often see added hormones as a negative, and there's a bad image around them, even though they scientifically don't necessarily have an impact on humans. For example, Coles. Coles makes a big deal these days on ads on TV about all of their chicken, but all of their beef as well is hormone free. So Coles isn't going to buy any cattle that are that have had HGP used on them. So that kind of makes the market a bit smaller, because obviously Woolies and Coles are the two major places that people in Australia get meat from. So that reduces the market for HGP meat, and it might put pressure on other places like Woolies, which do it still, which do use HGPs to not buy that anymore. Okay, so again, with an evaluation, you really need to do your own evaluation. It's up to you here. It's pretty 50-50 because there's a lot of places that won't buy meat that has had HGP, but there is a lot that will. So your opinion could go either way as long as you back up your judgment with some kind of criteria here. Okay, moving on to the last one, and genetics. And what we're talking about here is breeding and choosing different animals that have different characteristics to breed together. And so genetics just means heredity and variation of inherited characteristics. There's two kind of types, or we selectively breed animals. So we choose animals even in the same breed that might have different traits. Like one might be able to marble better, so you might choose that animal, that Angus cow, over another Angus cow to breed with. And there's also, this should say crossbreeding. It should say CROSS, crossbreeding, not crossbreeding. And basically what we're choosing is different breeds to breed together. And the reason we might want to do that is, for example, a breed might have a trait or a quality that we'd like to increase that another breed doesn't have. For example, Herefords might have a good size and a good mothering ability. An Angus bull has the ability to marble, whereas Herefords can't marble. So you might cross those together for that reason, and that's an outline of genetics. Belgian Blue, which is a cow that looks like this, is an animal that hasn't been genetically modified in any way. It is just naturally occurring. So over the last 40, 50 years, farmers have, or geneticists have chosen animals that, or bulls, cows and bulls from different breeds that have had double muscle and really large amount of muscle, and they've bred them together consistently over decades, and it's led to this animal. So this animal is considered natural, and it hasn't been genetically modified in any way. So this is an example of manipulating things for manipulating growth and development just by breeding, not needing to do hormone growth promotants in this case necessarily, not doing genetic modification. This is just breeding and genetics, and that has led to an increase in growth rate. It's obviously very large, very heavy, but also the amount of muscle compared to bone and fat is very high. So that's development in particular. All right, so the Belgian Blue is an example. It has double muscle. Another method, or two methods here, are AI and embryo transfer, artificial insemination as well. And these are both going to help improve growth and development, because you can choose traits that mean faster growth, maybe growing for longer but growing larger, and other traits like higher marbling from Angus, for example. And you can use both of these methods to do that. We look at embryo transfer and artificial insemination in more detail later. So positives of genetics. So you can get superior genetics compared to if you're just allowing animals to randomly mate. You can get hybrid vigor, which is where you cross two different breeds together, and they will give you superior traits to what either of their parents had. So they might have a much faster growth rate or higher marbling percentages than either of their parents. You're getting increased food conversion ratio potentially if you're breeding for that, and it allows you to meet specific market requirements. If you breed the wrong cows together, cow and bull together, for example, a negative of genetics is the possibility of dystocia. And dystocia just means trouble giving birth. It can lead to death. And for example, if you mated a really large bull with a really small female, that calf is going to be half mother, half father, half of the genetics from the mother and half from the father. And so it's going to end up being a larger calf because the bull is quite large, and the female, the mother, is quite small, and that can lead to difficulties actually giving birth because it's going to be a very large calf. And of course, another negative of genetics, there's not a lot, but there's no guarantee. I mean, when you breed animals together, the offspring will all show different traits. All right, so evaluation. You need to, again, do your own evaluation here. It'd be hard to give a negative evaluation of genetics. But yeah, you could do that if you wanted to, but it'd be hard. It's better to give a positive evaluation of genetics and to talk about why. And there's plenty of reasons there, including it being another positive we actually didn't write here was that it's considered natural by consumers. Consumers expect farmers to kind of use breeding techniques or genetic techniques to actually improve their cattle. They prefer it over things like adding things to feed and also hormone growth promotants, which we looked at before. All right, so past HSC questions. It doesn't get asked that often, but maybe it's kind of due to be asked soon. What is increased as a result of the use of HGPs in animals, the hormones? The answer is efficiency of food conversion. So it makes the animal more efficient at turning feed into weight. And lastly here, a 6-mark question. Explain the management techniques that a farmer can use to modify carcass composition. And so when you see this question, you should be thinking it's talking about development. This is important that you talk about development here. I've marked a few people's questions on this particular one in the past, and people often talked about, remember here it says techniques, so you have to talk about 2, but people often talked about maybe development for the first one, and then the second one they just talked about growth, or they didn't really mention development. And you really need to answer for this question when you're talking about the 2 techniques. So it's 6 marks. You need to do more than one technique for 6 marks. It says explain management techniques. It's a good idea to highlight the S in an exam so you don't forget to do the 2. You need to talk about development for both of them. It may address growth as well, but you specifically need to refer to development and maybe how it's going to increase the fat, or how it's going to increase the muscle, or how it's going to increase the bone. That's what you need to talk about here, because that's what it's asking. And of course, cause and effect. Now you can read this answer. This is a very good answer. This would be worth 6, and yeah, it's a very good answer. So it's a good example, but make sure that you do 2. It's a good idea if you're starting this question and you just haven't written anything, maybe write in here, just write the name of your first technique, and then halfway down here, write the name of your second technique. And that way, before you even start, you know, okay, I've got to do 2, and then you go about writing it. And when you've kind of finished writing the first one, you haven't forgotten, okay, I need to write a second one. That's just a couple of tips. Otherwise, that is the end of A7.